Hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're talking about something that confuses a lot of people with SIBO, and I definitely understand why. You'll often hear people say something like, a low FODMAP diet doesn't treat SIBO, but you should stay on a low fermentation diet to prevent it from coming back. And every time I hear that, I think, okay, but wait a second. If diet isn't actually getting rid of the bacteria, then how exactly is it preventing them from coming back? And that's the question we're going to unpack today. Now, before we dive in, I want to be really clear about something. I'm not anti-SIBO diet. And actually, I'm quite the opposite. I've worked with people with SIBO for well over a decade. I've created SIBO diet plans, and I use therapeutic diets every single day in practice because they absolutely can make people feel dramatically better. Because when you're painfully bloated after every meal, or constantly running to the bathroom, or dealing with constipation, or becoming afraid of food because you never know how your body is going to react, symptom relief matters a lot. So I'm not anti-SIBO diet, but over the years, I've also seen something else happen. Someone starts feeling better on a restrictive diet, so they assume the SIBO must be improving. Then every time they try to add foods back in, their symptoms flare and they start believing that those foods are, quote, feeding the SIBO. And before long, the diet becomes the only thing standing between them and feeling miserable, while the reason the bacteria accumulated in the first place has never really been addressed. So today we're going to talk about what low FODMAP and low fermentation diets actually do, how they're different, whether either one can truly prevent relapse, and how I think about using these diets in long-term SIBO care. Let's start with why SIBO diets make you feel better. Well, when bacteria in the small intestines ferment carbohydrates, they produce gases like hydrogen and methane, or in some people, hydrogen sulfide can also be involved. And because this fermentation is happening in the small intestine, unless we're talking about EMO or hydrogen sulfide or ESO, where it's happening in the large intestine, when it's happening in the small intestine, bacterial levels should generally be much lower. And therefore, the resulting gas that's produced in the small intestine causes bloating, abdominal pressure, pain, belching, changes in bowel movement, you name it, diarrhea, constipation, the gamut of these types of functional symptoms. And this is where diets like the low FODMAP or low fermentation can be genuinely helpful, because by reducing the amount or type of fermentable carbohydrates reaching bacteria in the small intestine, these diets temporarily provide less raw material for fermentation. And less fermentation generally means less gas, less pressure, and fewer digestive symptoms, sometimes surprisingly quickly. And when you're in a highly symptomatic period, that relief can be incredibly valuable. So, a therapeutic diet can make meals feel more manageable, it can reduce the intensity of symptoms, it can help someone maintain a more consistent food intake, because when you feel better, you're able to eat better. And it can allow them to function more normally while the other pieces of the puzzle are being addressed. So when I say that diet is primarily a symptom management tool, I don't mean that dismissively. Symptom relief matters, and being able to eat without immediately becoming painfully bloated matters. Having enough predictability to work and travel and sleep and participate in daily life is important. The important distinction is what that improvement does and does not tell us. Feeling better on a SIBO diet tells us that reducing fermentation is helping to control symptoms. It does not necessarily tell us that the bacterial overgrowth is gone or that the reason it developed has been corrected. And I did explain in a recent episode about long-term SIBO diets that symptom relief and gut healing can look very similar at first, even though they're not the same process. We'll link to that episode in the show notes. And here we're taking that distinction one step further by asking whether reducing fermentation can do more than manage symptoms and if it can actually prevent SIBO from recurring. So let's talk about the difference. Why does feeling better not mean that the SIBO is gone? So low FODMAP and low fermentation diets do not kill bacteria responsible for SIBO. They are not antimicrobial strategies, and they have not been shown to eliminate bacterial overgrowth. What they do is reduce the amount of fermentable material available to bacteria. And as a result, the bacteria produce less gas and symptoms improve. And it can feel as though the SIBO itself is going away. But unless something else is being done to directly address the overgrowth, the diet is controlling its effects, not eliminating them. So think of it as turning down the fuel supply to a fire. The flames become smaller, but the fire has not been extinguished, nor have the conditions that allowed it to start have been corrected. So this is why symptoms can return so quickly when fermentable foods are added back, and why you might feel great when you're following the diet, but you eat a meal that's off plan and you flare. It does not mean that those foods are inherently harmful or need to be avoided permanently. And that's something that we kind of know intuitively, and why a lot of people feel like it doesn't make sense because it's a lot of the healthy foods that seem to be bothering me. But I thought these foods were good for me. So they are nutritionally and from a general health perspective. But what it means is that the bacteria have this fermentable material available to them higher up in the digestive tract than is normal. And they're feeding on these healthy foods when they normally be fully or at least partially broken down by the time the food makes contact with bacteria in the large intestine. But instead, these healthy foods, these fibers, these fermentable carbohydrates are coming into contact with bacteria earlier than they ever would, and that's where we're getting the fermentation. When we reduce these foods, the overgrowth has not necessarily been adequately addressed, and the underlying contributor, such as impaired motility or constipation, may still be creating these conditions that allow it to persist and return. And the reverse is also true. Ongoing symptoms do not prove that SIBO is still present. So bloating, abdominal pain, constipation, and diarrhea can have many causes. Someone could continue experiencing symptoms after the overgrowth has been addressed because other digestive issues are contributing to them. For example, you could have diarrhea because you're not digesting fats optimally, and that would have nothing to do directly with the bacteria overgrowth. So, symptoms can tell us how somebody feels, but they cannot reliably confirm whether SIBO is present or gone. And a successful symptom management diet and a successful SIBO care plan are two entirely different things. Feeling better tells us that the diet is helping control your symptoms. It does not tell us that the SIBO is gone. So let's talk about the difference between low FODMAP and low fermentation diets, because they're really just different approaches to the same goal. The low FODMAP and low fermentation diets are both designed to reduce excessive fermentation and make digestive symptoms more manageable. But they decide which foods to restrict in very different ways, and those differences matter. Here's the simplest way to think about the difference. Low FODMAP is like a detailed sorting system. It looks at the specific types and amounts of fermentable carbohydrates in each food rather than treating all carbohydrates or all fiber as a problem. And that leaves room for a surprisingly wide variety of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, and even certain portions of legumes. Low fermentation uses a broader shortcut. It favors foods that are digested and absorbed more easily, leaving less material behind for bacteria to ferment. And that's why white bread, white rice, white pasta, and potatoes can fit into a diet, while many beans and whole grains and salads and high fiber vegetables do not. It's also why onion and garlic can be allowed, even though they are restricted on the low FODMAP. The two diets are trying to turn down fermentation, but they use completely different sets of rules to decide what stays on the plate. And as a dietitian, I'll be upfront that I generally lean toward the approach that allows someone to eat the widest possible variety of nourishing plant foods. And that doesn't mean one diet is universally better than the other. It means I look at dietary freedom, not only in terms of how easy a diet is to follow in a restaurant, but also in terms of the variety of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds a person can keep on their plate. So let's break down the low FODMAP diet. FODMAPs are short chain carbohydrates that are poorly absorbed in the small intestine and readily fermented by gut bacteria. And they include fructans, galacto-oligosaccharides, lactose, excess fructose, and polyols, which are distributed across many different food groups. The low FODMAP diet was developed as a symptom management strategy for IBS. It begins with the temporary elimination phase, followed by systematic reintroduction and long-term personalization. The goal is not to avoid every high FODMAP food forever. It's to determine which specific FODMAP groups, foods, and portions actually trigger symptoms for that individual. One of the strengths of this approach is that it does not treat all fiber-rich foods as equally problematic. Someone may need to avoid onion and garlic during the elimination phase, for example, while still eating low FODMAP portions of berries, kiwi, oranges, oats, quinoa, chia seeds, walnuts, certain legumes, leafy greens, and a wide variety of other fruits and vegetables. And that matters to me as a dietitian. Because even during the restrictive phase, we can usually build a diet containing a meaningful variety of plant foods and sources of fiber. And once reintroduction begins, the diet should become even more expansive based on the person's actual tolerance. The downside is that low FODMAP can be incredibly difficult to follow in the real world. Onion, garlic, wheat, and lactose are in so many restaurant dishes, often in ways you can't even see, because they can be hidden in sauces and marinades and dressings and soups and breadings and seasoning blends and all kinds of prepared foods, which can make eating out feel impossible sometimes. So while the diet may allow a wide variety of nutritious foods on paper, it can feel incredibly restrictive socially and practically. Now let's break down the low fermentation diet. The low fermentation diet was developed specifically with SIBO and abnormal fermentation in mind. So instead of categorizing foods according to their FODMAP content, it emphasizes carbohydrates that are more easily digested and absorbed, leaving less material behind for bacteria to ferment. It also incorporates meal spacing, so allowing approximately 4 to 5 hours between meals gives the migrating motor complex an opportunity to perform its normal housekeeping activity in the small intestine. And this is an important distinction because the diet is not focused solely on what you eat. It also considers how eating patterns may affect the small intestinal clearance. The low fermentation diet is often described as less restrictive than low FODMAP, and from a practical standpoint, I can understand why. It permits foods like onions, garlic, white bread, white pasta, which makes it much easier to walk into a restaurant and order a relatively ordinary meal. Steak with potatoes and vegetables, or even a sandwich on white bread are completely workable without having to investigate every seasoning, every sauce, and every trace of onion or garlic. But this is where my dietitian brain has a different response to the word restrictive. The low fermentation diet limits many foods that provide the fermentable fibers we intentionally use to support the large intestinal microbiome. Beans and legumes, whole grains, large salads, leafy vegetables, and many cruciferous vegetables are restricted, while more refined carbohydrates such as white bread, white pasta, and white rice and potatoes are emphasized because they're more readily absorbed. And to be completely honest, the low fermentation diet reminds me and many of my dietitian colleagues of the traditional clinical bland or low residue diet. It leans heavily on white bread, white rice, white pasta, white potatoes, a lot of white foods, a lot of refined or easily digested starches, while limiting many of the high fiber or fiber-rich plant foods that we would ordinarily encourage for long-term digestive and overall health. And that may make sense during a highly symptomatic period, and there may be certain chronic relapsers for whom some version of this approach is useful. But from a dietitian's perspective, it is difficult to look at that eating pattern as an ideal long-term destination for most people. And it's not just dietitians. Many patients notice the same disconnect. They may feel better from a symptom management standpoint, but they're also feeling like many of the foods they've always understood to be healthy have disappeared from their diet. And I've heard many patients say, why can't I eat the healthy foods? I miss my salads. I miss my vegetables. I miss my, legumes. And this creates an interesting trade-off. So the low fermentation may be more expansive socially and practically because it is easier to order an ordinary meal without worrying about every bit of onion, garlic, wheat, dairy, or seasoning. The low FODMAP may be more expansive nutritionally because it can preserve a broader variety of fiber-rich plant foods, particularly when portions are individualized and the diet progresses through reintroduction. So how do you choose between the two? Should you be on the low FODMAP or should you choose the low fermentation approach? Choosing between these approaches is not simply a matter of asking which one allows more foods. Low fermentation may offer more freedom socially and practically, while the low FODMAP may preserve a broader variety of fiber-rich, microbiome-supportive foods. But neither advantage matters if the diet does not provide adequate symptom relief or cannot realistically be followed. Fiber tolerance is another important clinical consideration. People with, for example, methane dominant overgrowth or EMO or methane SIBO and significant constipation are often particularly sensitive to fiber, and that's something we see frequently in practice. So for them, the broader selection of fiber-rich foods allowed on the low FODMAP may look better nutritionally without necessarily feeling better digestively. And a lot of people with methane SIBO tend to feel better with less fiber. And that does not mean they must automatically follow the low fermentation diet. I think a low FODMAP approach can be temporarily modified to reduce fiber, to reduce resistant starch, and other foods that commonly aggravate methane-related constipation and bloating, like heavy fatty meals. This is exactly why I created the Methane SIBO diet plan, which we will link to in the show notes for you to download. And this diet plan combines low FODMAP principles with additional modifications for the symptoms and food tolerances we commonly see with methane overgrowth. So I do have a preference, but it's not a rigid rule. In general, I want to preserve as much plant variety and fermentable fiber as someone can comfortably tolerate because those foods help support the large intestinal microbiome. At the same time, there are people with recurrent SIBO, impaired motility, methane-related constipation, or pronounced fiber intolerance where the low fermentation approach may be a more realistic and effective option. Ultimately, calling one diet less restrictive depends on what we are measuring. Is it easier to order in a restaurant? Does it preserve a wider variety of fiber-rich plant foods? Does it adequately control symptoms? The best approach is really going to be the one that strikes the right balance between symptom relief, nutritional quality, microbiome support, and freedom in everyday life for that individual. So let's talk a little bit more about reducing fermentation and whether or not that can prevent SIBO relapse. Now, this is where the role of diet becomes more complicated. The rationale behind using a low fermentation diet after SIBO care is straightforward. When fewer fermentable carbohydrates reach the small intestine, bacteria have less material available to ferment, and that means less gas production and, in many cases, fewer symptoms. But fewer symptoms are not the same as relapse prevention. So we need to distinguish between two completely different outcomes. The diet prevents bacteria from accumulating in the small intestine again, or the bacteria accumulate again, but the diet reduces how much gas and how many symptoms they produce. Those two scenarios can look exactly the same. Someone continues following the diet and feels relatively well, so it appears that the SIBO has not returned. But symptoms alone cannot tell us whether the diet prevented bacterial overgrowth or simply kept a returning overgrowth quieter. The same problem arises when fermentable foods are added back. If symptoms suddenly increase, it does not mean those foods caused SIBO to return. More likely, they exposed an overgrowth or underlying digestive vulnerability that was already there by giving the bacteria more material to ferment. And at this point, we do not have clinical evidence demonstrating that a low fermentation diet prevents SIBO recurrence. A 2025 review of nutritional approaches to SIBO describes relapse prevention as a theoretical benefit of diet, not one that has been established in clinical trials. So we know that reducing fermentation can control symptoms. We do not know that it stops bacteria from accumulating in the small intestine again. And that does not make diet irrelevant to long-term symptom management because for someone with a persistent motility disorder, altered anatomy, adhesions, or another risk factor that cannot be fully corrected, reducing the fermentation burden may help maintain symptom stability. But that is symptom and risk management, not proof that this diet is preventing SIBO. Diet should never be asked to carry the entire relapse prevention plan because lasting stability depends on addressing the reasons bacteria were able to accumulate in the first place. There's also a cost to keeping fermentable carbohydrates low. Many of these foods provide the fibers that nourish the beneficial bacteria in the large intestine and support a healthy, diverse microbiome. The more restrictive the diet becomes, and the longer it continues, the more carefully we need to weigh symptom relief against nutritional adequacy, microbiome support, and quality of life. And I explore those trade offs in the other podcast episode that I recently released that we're going to link to in the show notes about why long term SIBO safe diets might be keeping your gut fragile. So, for some chronic relapsers, a modified low fermentation diet may really be one useful part of a long term plan. For others, it might simply just keep the symptoms of an unresolved problem quieter while unnecessarily limiting the foods that support long term gut health. And the right amount of dietary modification depends on why the SIBO keeps returning, which contributors or root causes can be addressed, and whether the benefits of restriction still outweigh the costs. So let's talk about the special case of post-infectious SIBO and lasting MMC impairment. Now, food poisoning is one of the most important pathways that researchers have identified between a previously healthy digestive system and later developing IBS or SIBO. But that does not mean every person with SIBO developed it from food poisoning, nor does every person who gets food poisoning develop lasting digestive problems. Research suggests that approximately 1 in 9 people who experience infectious gastroenteritis goes on to develop post-infectious IBS. And that process begins with certain bacteria that cause food poisoning, including Campylobacter, Salmonella, Shigella, and some strains of E. coli. These bacteria produce a toxin called CDTB. The immune system creates antibodies against that toxin, but CDTB resembles vinculin, a protein involved in the nerves and pacemaker cells that coordinate intestinal movement. So in susceptible people, the immune response can mistakenly target vinculin as well. And that matters because the small intestine relies on a series of sweeping contractions called the migrating motor complex or the MMC. So these cleaning waves happen between meals and they help move residual food and bacteria and debris out of the small intestine. And when that system is impaired, bacteria are more likely to accumulate where they don't belong. And there's also a spectrum. Some people experience relatively mild or temporary disruption and do well once the SIBO has been addressed and consistent meal spacing and motility support are in place. Others experience a stronger or more persistent autoimmune response and relapse more easily. About half of people with post-infectious IBS eventually recover, although that recovery can take months or years. Food poisoning can create a lasting vulnerability, but it does not automatically sentence every affected person to permanent MMC dysfunction or lifelong dietary restriction. And research helps us understand why that vulnerability varies. Because in animal models, repeated exposure to Campylobacter has been associated with higher antibody levels, greater loss of insulin, and a greater likelihood of developing SIBO. More recent human research has also found that antivinculin levels may correlate with the severity of IBS symptoms. What we cannot yet do is use an antibody level to predict exactly how impaired someone's MMC is or how quickly their SIBO will return. And this is the context in which Dr. Pimentel's recommendation to use the low fermentation diet as maintenance really makes sense, because if impaired MMC function continues to create an opportunity for bacteria to accumulate, reducing the amount of material available for fermentation can really keep symptoms quieter. So the diet is tended to help people remain stable symptom-wise longer and reduce the need for repeated courses of SIBO care. But the diet is still a workaround for impaired motility. It does not repair the damaged cleaning waves. And that distinction changes the order in which I approach relapse prevention. So after the overgrowth has been addressed, I want to support the MMC as effectively as possible through adequate meal spacing, prokinetic support when indicated, and attention to any other factors slowing intestinal transit. Then I want to gradually broaden the diet and see whether the person actually relapses. I do not want to recommend indefinite carbohydrate restriction in anticipation of a recurrence that may never happen. And in practice, we do see people where food poisoning was their root cause and they stay on a prokinetic or they meal space for a few months or longer and they don't see a recurrence. So I think, even though we don't have research to support this, it seems that the more severe the MMC impairment is, the greater the risk of recurrence. And many people will remain stable with those measures in place and will not need to rely on a long-term low fermentation diet. And if symptoms return, we need to determine whether SIBO has actually recurred rather than assuming that a reaction to a fermentable food proves relapse. Because a lot of times people will freak out. I've seen this so many times. You'll be feeling fine, you'll have eradicated your SIBO, and then you eat a food and you flare and you panic. I mean, we get paranoid, right? We feel like, oh my God, it's come back, because it feels exactly the same for those couple days as when you had it. But one flare does not mean that it's a relapse. And if someone continues to have confirmed recurrences despite motility and relapse prevention support, that's when we think, okay, there may be a more persistent underlying relapse vulnerability. So for that smaller group, a modified low fermentation diet may become a practical part of long-term management. And this is very different from placing everyone with a history of SIBO on the low fermentation diet indefinitely. So the goal is to put the best relapse prevention strategies in place first, expand the diet as tolerated, and then let the person's actual clinical course tell us whether additional dietary restriction is necessary. And if it is, we use only as much restriction as that person genuinely needs. So, the diet is truly only one part of SIBO relapse prevention, because if reducing fermentation is not enough to prevent SIBO from returning, what does that mean? What does a more comprehensive relapse prevention plan look like? Well, it starts by identifying why bacteria were able to accumulate in the small intestine in the first place. And depending on the person, that may involve things like impaired motility, chronic constipation, pelvic floor dysfunction, medication effects, impaired digestion, nervous system dysregulation, altered anatomy, adhesions, or several overlapping contributors. And some of these problems can be corrected or substantially improved. Others may need to be managed proactively over time. This is actually a huge topic: root causes, root contributors, and relapse prevention. And there's far more to say about it than I can reasonably cover here. I did record an entire podcast episode about SIBO root contributors, and why clearing the overgrowth is not enough. We're going to link to that in the show notes if this has piqued your interest. And in that episode, I break down the different factors that can drive recurring SIBO and what a more comprehensive relapse prevention plan might look like. So be sure to check that out, because really what I'm saying in this conversation is the alternative is to actually address the root contributors to prevent the bacterial overgrowth from recurring versus just not feeding the overgrowth to keep symptoms down. So the main point is that relapse prevention should never rest entirely on avoiding fermentable carbohydrates. Diet might be one part of the plan, but it cannot do the work of identifying and addressing the underlying reasons SIBO keeps recurring. Now let's talk about when longer term dietary modification might be reasonable, because none of this means that every single person should return to a completely unrestricted diet immediately after addressing SIBO. In general, the further we get in clearing the overgrowth and improving motility and maintaining that progress, the more expansive the diet can become. But that process takes time, and not every underlying contributor can be fully corrected. Some people have a persistent reason SIBO keeps returning. So that might include significantly impaired MMC function after repeated episodes of food poisoning, elevated antivinculin antibodies suggesting a stronger post-infectious autoimmune response, altered anatomy, adhesions, autonomic dysfunction, or a connective tissue disorder such as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. In these cases, we may be able to improve motility and reduce the risk of recurrence or reduce the rate of recurrence without completely removing that underlying vulnerability. And that is when a longer term lower fermentation pattern may make sense. So we are not using diet instead of addressing the overgrowth or supporting motility. We're using it as one part of maintenance for someone whose physiology continues to make recurrence more likely. Maintenance should still be highly personalized, and that's why even the low FODMAP diet ends with a personalization phase. You identify the foods and portions that consistently cause symptoms, limit those as needed, and bring everything else back. The same principles apply here. For one person, maintenance may mean eating smaller portions of a few highly fermentable foods. And for another, it might mean eating certain foods less frequently, temporarily tightening the diet during a flare, or following a moderately low fermentation pattern most of the time. It should not mean defaulting to the most restrictive version of a diet and staying there forever without periodically assessing tolerance. And the diet also needs to earn its place. If it provides meaningful symptom relief, supports nutritional adequacy, and makes everyday life easier, the benefit is real. For some people, the low fermentation diet may actually provide more social freedom because it makes restaurants and ordinary mixed meals easier to navigate. For others, its restrictions on fiber-rich plant foods may feel like a much greater nutritional and practical sacrifice. So your goal is not a perfectly unrestricted diet or the lowest possible fermentation at any cost. If longer-term modification is genuinely necessary, we use only as much restriction as the person needs and continue looking for opportunities to expand from there. The real goal is the broadest diet your gut can comfortably support. It's not to remain unnecessarily restricted forever, but it's also not to force yourself to eat foods that repeatedly cause significant symptoms simply because they're considered good for your microbiome. What we're working toward is the most varied, nourishing, and flexible diet your gut can comfortably support at your current stage. And that last part matters because your tolerance today is not necessarily your tolerance forever. As motility, digestion, bowel regularity, and microbial health improve, the diet can often continue expanding too. Variety also does not require eating a large portion of everything. One of the things I love about low FODMAP is that it often allows us to include small amounts of many different foods. A full serving of something might cause symptoms, while a smaller portion fits beautifully. And that's exactly why I love the idea behind a veggie mash. I actually have a recipe and a guide for how to make a veggie mash, which we will throw into the show notes as well. But this combines small portions of many different vegetables to increase plant variety without creating an overwhelming fermentable load. Those little bits of variety still expose the gut microbiome to a wider range of fibers and plant compounds, and they give us somewhere to build from as your tolerance improves. So that means approaching food with some curiosity instead of following rigid rules. Try a smaller portion. Look for a repeatable pattern rather than judging a food based on one symptomatic meal. Reassess foods over time instead of making permanent decisions about them during the most symptomatic phase of your recovery. Success is not perfect adherence to low FODMAP or low fermentation or any other specific diet. Success is needing fewer restrictions to remain well while having an effective plan in place for the underlying factors that increase your risk of relapse. The diet is there to support your progress, not to become the final destination. So, diet may be part of maintenance, but it should not have to carry the whole plan. So, if there's one thing I hope you take away from today's episode, it's this. Your SIBO diet is a tool. It's a really valuable tool, but it's still just one tool. If you feel dramatically better on a low FODMAP or low fermentation diet, that's wonderful. That symptom relief is real and it's important, but it doesn't mean that the bacteria are gone necessarily. And if your symptoms come back when you start expanding your diet, that doesn't necessarily mean you need an even smaller food list forever. Sometimes it simply tells us there is still more work to do with the underlying factors that allowed the SIBO to develop or return in the first place. Or sometimes it means the SIBO is not cleared all the way and we need to keep going with eradication. My goal is never to keep someone on the most restrictive diet they can tolerate. My goal is to help them build the broadest, most nourishing, most flexible diet their gut can comfortably support while addressing the root contributors that increase the risk of relapse. Because at the end of the day, I don't want your diet to be the thing holding your symptoms together. I want your gut to become more resilient so your diet can become bigger, not smaller over time. So, as always, thanks so much for listening. If you found this episode helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone who's trying to make sense of all the conflicting information about SIBO diets. Well, that's your gut check for this week. Come back next week for your next gut check.